How did a tiny fuse, smaller than a coffee cup, become the hidden weapon that changed the outcome of the Second World War? It did not roar like the atomic bomb, or glow across radar screens like the invention of microwave detection. It did not receive the fame of Enigma or the glory of jet engines. Yet, hidden inside the nose of a 5-inch shell was a miracle of engineering miniaturized electronics. Vacuum tubes hardened against impossible forces, and a radar brain capable of deciding the exact instant to detonate. This thinking weapon was called the proximity fuse, and it transformed the battlefield with such sweeping consequences that generals, sailors, and even Winston Churchill himself would later argue it stood second only to the atomic bomb in its strategic impact. By the time it entered combat, entire German battalions were being annihilated in minutes. Kamikaze waves were collapsing against invisible walls of fire, and London's survival against the V-1 flying bomb seemed assured. Yet its story begins in laboratories, in secrecy, and in the minds of physicists who believed that science could rewrite the very rules of survival. For 4 years, the Wehrmacht had relied on an immutable rule of modern battle: entrenchment saves lives. Shells that detonated on the ground scattered fragments sideways, allowing foxholes to shield those who dug deep enough. Even in Stalingrad, even across the vast Russian steppes, men had survived through dirt, logs, and luck. But on that December morning, nothing worked. Richter watched in disbelief as American shells did something entirely unnatural. They burst, not on the frozen earth, but in the thin air 30 feet above, sending steel fragments downward like scythes cutting wheat. In less than 3 minutes, 700 German soldiers lay dead or dying. Those who staggered back repeated one phrase again and again: Die Lufttötet, the air kills. Unknown to Richter, he was witnessing the combat debut of the proximity fuse in ground warfare. For 2 years, the weapon had been whispered about within Allied navies and guarded with tighter secrecy than even radar. It was so precious that initial orders forbade its use on land for fear of capture. But the German offensive, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge, forced American commanders to unleash their hidden ace. The effect was immediate. American artillery, once a blunt instrument that relied on massed barrages and mathematical hope, suddenly became a scalpel of annihilation. Where conventional shells killed soldiers in trenches only 5% of the time, the proximity fuse achieved 70% casualty rates. Where a battalion might once have endured a barrage, now it dissolved into chaos, unable to find shelter. The diary entries, combat reports, and survivor testimonies all paint the same picture. The battlefield itself had changed in a single morning. Centuries of doctrine, from the 30 Years' War through the Somme, had depended on earthworks as salvation. With a thinking fuse, dirt and logs became irrelevant. The air itself had been weaponized. General George S. Patton, ever prone to blunt statements, would later cable Washington with words that historians still quote: "The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. Battalion caught on the Sour River by actual count. 700 dead. Survivors surrendered at once. This is a magnificent weapon. When all armies get it, we will need new methods of war." To the German infantry who endured it, the psychological effect may have been worse than the physical destruction. Foxholes, forests, bunkers, none offered safety. A Feldwebel captured 2 days later explained to interrogators, "We dove into the earth, but the shells burst above us. We ran into the trees, and the shells burst among the branches. It was as if the Americans had taught their artillery to follow us everywhere." But perhaps the most remarkable truth is this: the miracle was not born on that December battlefield. Its roots stretched back 5 years, to a desperate Britain facing annihilation, and to scientists who dared to imagine that electricity and radio could be hardened into a fuse. To understand how a coffee cup-sized device rewrote warfare, we must return to October 1939, when Britain's survival depended on mathematics and imagination more than soldiers or ships. And so the story moves from snow-covered Belgium back to a modest laboratory in England, where a young scientist named William Butement first asked the question that would lead to the world's first smart weapon. What if a shell could think for itself? October 30th, 1939. Britain was entering its first winter of war. The leaves along the hedgerows of Essex had turned brittle and brown, and the skies above were heavy with the threat of bombers that had not yet come. Inside a modest office at the Air Defense Establishment, a young scientist named W.A.S. Butement drafted a proposal that seemed closer to fantasy than weaponry. He suggested an artillery shell that could think. Why was this needed? The mathematics were brutal. In the First World War, British anti-aircraft gunners had required 8,500 shells for every enemy plane destroyed. By 1939, aircraft flew faster, higher, and with greater maneuverability. The odds had worsened, with some calculations estimating over 10,000 rounds per kill. Britain could not afford such waste, not with her factories already stretched to produce Hurricanes and Spitfires. Butement, together with colleagues Edward Shire and Amherst Thompson, envisioned a different future. If a shell could be taught to sense an approaching aircraft and detonate automatically within 70 feet, each round would be worth dozens of conventional ones. The odds of hitting a bomber would shift dramatically. By June 1940, the British had built prototypes, testing them against balloons with unrotated projectiles. The results proved the principle, but the technology collapsed under stress. Vacuum tubes cracked, circuits tore apart, batteries failed. Britain had the idea, but not the means. At the same time, the island nation faced its darkest hour. The Luftwaffe prepared for the Blitz. Submarines prowled the Atlantic. Resources dwindled. Britain simply could not spare the manpower or money for an unproven miracle. And so the idea, brilliant yet fragile, awaited rescue. That rescue would come from across the Atlantic. September 6, 1940. Halifax, Nova Scotia. Dockworkers watched in silence as the Canadian Pacific liner Duchess of Richmond slipped into port. On board was not gold, not weapons, but something far more valuable: secrets. Locked in a small black deed box were the crown jewels of British science: radar blueprints, jet engine designs, explosives research, and one embryonic concept for a radio fuse. The man carrying them was Sir Henry Tizard, head of Britain's Aeronautical Research Committee. This mission was unprecedented. Britain was fighting for survival, yet it was handing over its most closely guarded technologies to a country that was not even at war. Why? Because Britain could not win alone. The nation that had stood against Napoleon and the Kaiser now placed its hope in an ally across the ocean: the United States. By September 12th, Tizard and his delegation were installed at Washington's Wardman Park Hotel. For days, they revealed treasure after treasure to astonished American officials. The SCR-584 radar system, jet turbine prototypes, advanced explosives all laid bare. But on September 19th, in a conference room overlooking Connecticut Avenue, physicist Dr. John Cockcroft presented the concept that would seize one man's imagination completely. When Cockcroft explained Britain's work on the radio fuse, Tuve leaned forward, transfixed. He understood both the brilliance and the fatal flaw. Britain had the theory, but not the technology, to make it survive inside a shell. Tuve's mind raced with possibilities: miniaturized vacuum tubes, reinforced circuits, reserve batteries. America had the industrial base. Perhaps it could be done. The Tizard mission, as it would be called, became the greatest scientific handoff in history. Churchill himself approved it, gambling Britain's future on trust. The Americans received not only knowledge but responsibility. Tuve and his growing team now bore the weight of an entire war. And so, as the London Blitz raged, as Coventry burned, and as U-boats prowled the Atlantic, a small group of American physicists began working inside converted garages, abandoned dealerships, and secret labs. Their task: to make a shell think. Autumn of 1940, Washington, D.C. still smelled of coal smoke from furnaces that battled the crisp winds sweeping down from the Alleghenies. Within the makeshift offices of the National Defense Research Committee, Merle Tuve sat at his desk, a cigarette burning away to ash in an overfilled tray. Around him were stacks of reports, diagrams, and laboratory notes, many stamped S.E. Cret in red ink. Outside the window, the capital seemed calm, but Tuve knew the world was on fire. France had fallen. Britain stood alone. And Germany's bombers darkened the skies over London. He assembled a team that looked more like a graduate seminar than a military unit. There was James Van Allen, then a young physicist who would later become famous for discovering Earth's radiation belts. There was Harry Diamond, an electrical wizard with the Bureau of Standards. There were young engineers from Johns Hopkins University's Applied Physics Laboratory, men and women barely in their 20s, who had never seen combat but understood electronics in their bones. In November 1940, Tuve walked into a converted garage in Silver Spring, Maryland. It would become the beating heart of Section T. Engineers cleared space between discarded auto parts, set up benches with oscilloscopes, and began winding coils by hand. Every night, Tuve visited each station, peppering workers with questions, challenging assumptions, demanding solutions. His leadership style was not gentle. He could be curt, even intimidating, but his clarity of purpose was magnetic. People followed because they sensed history depended on their success. Section T adopted a mantra: failure is not allowed. Within weeks, they built crude prototypes, metal casings stuffed with fragile vacuum tubes, wires coiled like snakes, batteries assembled from glass ampules that had to be crushed to activate. Every prototype shattered under test fire. But instead of despair, Tuve saw progress. Each failure revealed a weakness to be solved. By Christmas of 1940, the first real breakthrough came. Van Allen, experimenting with new tube designs, produced a miniaturized triode encased in a rugged glass envelope that withstood shocks previously thought impossible. At the same time, Harry Diamond perfected a reserve battery activated by impact force, stable, until needed, instantly reliable under fire. Piece by piece, the impossible was becoming plausible. Tuve reported to Vannevar Bush in January 1941, "It can be done. It will be done. But we must have total commitment." Bush, recognizing both Tuve's brilliance and his audacity, gave Section T the resources it demanded. Contracts went out to firms like Sylvania Electric and Crossley Corporation to begin preliminary production planning. By spring, Section T had a clear mission: design a fuse no larger than a fist, strong enough to endure the violence of a gun barrel, smart enough to sense an aircraft, and simple enough to mass-produce by the millions. It was a mission no one else on Earth could attempt. The greatest enemy of Section T was not Germany, but physics itself. A 5-inch naval gun could hurl a projectile at 2,600 feet per second, subjecting it to accelerations over 20,000 Gs. For perspective, the human body loses consciousness at 5 Gs, and jet pilots risk death at 9. Vacuum tubes, those delicate glass cylinders filled with filaments and electrodes, were designed for radios sitting peacefully on desks, not for shells screaming out of cannons. Tuve's team approached the problem like surgeons working on fragile organs. They needed to make tubes small enough to survive violence, yet strong enough to function. Standard tubes shattered like eggshells. The solution was radical miniaturization. By shrinking the tubes to the size of a fingertip, the stress on their internal parts was reduced. Every success brought new obstacles. The fuses also needed a safety and arming mechanism. No one wanted a shell detonating inside a gun barrel or during loading. The system had to remain inert until the projectile had traveled far enough to endanger an enemy aircraft. Engineers devised ingenious mechanical timers triggered by centrifugal force. As the shell spun through the air, tiny weights rotated outward, gradually aligning circuits until the fuse was live. By mid-1941, the first prototypes survived gunfire without shattering. That alone was considered a miracle. But the devices still misfired, often detonating prematurely or failing altogether. He ordered hundreds of additional tests, demanding refinements in metallurgy, wiring, and insulation. The secrecy was absolute. Workers at subcontractor factories often did not know what they were building. Assemblers thought they were making parts for radios or scientific instruments. Only the core Section T staff grasped the enormity of the project. Tuve himself reminded them, "Loose talk can kill men in London, as surely as bombs." By autumn 1941, live-fire trials showed promise. For the first time, shells detonated in the vicinity of target drones without requiring direct hits. Observers watching the puffs of black smoke in the sky felt chills. It was as if the air itself had become lethal. The phrase would later echo in German reports, "Die Luft tötet," the air kills. Still, the road ahead was long. Manufacturing tolerances had to be exact. Each fuse contained over 100 individual parts. If one was misaligned by a millimeter, the device failed. Tuve pushed for unprecedented quality control, establishing inspection regimes that became models for later electronics industries. By the time the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Section T had achieved the impossible. A prototype proximity fuse that could be mass-produced. It was not perfect, but it worked. And in war, good enough could change history. The next step would be scaling production from dozens to thousands, then millions, without sacrificing reliability. That challenge would test not only science, but America's industrial might. December of 1941 brought both disaster and opportunity. The smoking ruins of Pearl Harbor were still visible when President Franklin Roosevelt declared war. Across America, factories switched overnight from cars to tanks, from refrigerators to bombers, from radios to proximity fuses. For Section T, the timing was paradoxical. Just as the fuse became viable, demand for it skyrocketed beyond anything Tuve had imagined. The task fell to companies like Sylvania, Electric, Crosley Corporation, Raytheon, and Eastman Kodak. These firms, already skilled in electronics or precision optics, were recruited under strict secrecy. Engineers accustomed to making home radios suddenly found themselves producing weapons so classified that even assembly line supervisors did not know their purpose. Workers thought they were building components for radar sets or aircraft instruments. In reality, they were manufacturing the heart of the most advanced fuse ever conceived. Industrial mobilization also demanded new materials. Traditional vacuum tubes used tungsten and molybdenum, metals in short supply. Engineers experimented with substitutes, carefully balancing performance with availability. Glassblowers devised new shapes to withstand G-forces. Their craftsmanship scaled up into automated assembly lines. The reserve battery, with its fragile ampule, required invention of shockproof casings that could be mass-produced without leaks. By mid-1942, factories were producing proximity fuses in the thousands per week. By 1943, production rose to 40,000 per month, and by 1944, it exceeded 80,000 monthly units. Ultimately, over 22 million fuses would be built during the war. Each one represented not just science, but the collective effort of a nation turned into a war machine. The proximity fuse became a triumph of American mass production. It married laboratory genius with assembly line discipline, demonstrating that the same system that produced refrigerators and radios could also deliver the most advanced weapon in the world. Yet the fuse was still unproven in combat. Paper reports and test ranges were one thing. Would it work when fired at enemy aircraft? Would the fragile electronics survive naval guns? Would the safety mechanisms prevent catastrophic accidents? The only way to know was to put it into the hands of sailors and let them fire at the enemy. The U.S. Navy had been skeptical from the beginning. Naval officers had seen miracle weapons promised before, only to fail under the brutal realities of sea combat. But in early 1942, with Japanese planes terrorizing the Pacific, they were willing to try anything. The first live naval tests were conducted aboard the USS Cleveland, and later the USS Helena, both light cruisers equipped with 5-inch anti-aircraft guns. The trials took place in Chesapeake Bay, under tight secrecy. Sailors were briefed only in vague terms. They were to fire at target drones. But the shells were special. Few knew the extraordinary gamble being taken. Observers gathered on deck as drones buzzed into view. Gunners loaded the experimental shells, bracing for disappointment. The first rounds screamed skyward, exploding harmlessly. But then came the moment that changed history. A drone disintegrated mid-air, shredded by fragments from a shell that had not struck it directly but detonated near it. Gasps erupted on deck. The air itself had killed. In subsequent tests, proximity fuses achieved hit probabilities 5 times greater than conventional timed or contact shells. For the first time, anti-aircraft gunners could strike planes without direct hits, detonating shells in their lethal radius. The effect was devastating. Still, safety remained a paramount concern. What if a fuse detonated prematurely and destroyed a ship's own gun? Engineers assured the Navy that safety mechanisms prevented this, but officers demanded proof. Thousands of rounds were test-fired before combat approval was granted. Each successful test built confidence. By late 1942, proximity fuses were cleared for operational use at sea. Their debut came in the Solomon Islands campaign, where Japanese bombers and torpedo planes repeatedly attacked U.S. fleets. On January 5, 1943, during a raid near Guadalcanal, the USS Helena's gunners used proximity-fused shells in combat for the first time. The results were astonishing. 6 Japanese planes were destroyed in minutes, more than the ship had ever downed in months of fighting. Reports described enemy pilots breaking formation, panicked by invisible explosions that erupted near their aircraft. Word spread quickly through the fleet. Sailors called the new weapon the Deadly Wizard and the Unseen Gunner. The Japanese, baffled by their sudden losses, suspected secret radar beams or invisible fighters. In reality, it was tiny glass tubes and circuits hidden inside shells, products of Section T's relentless work. The Navy guarded the secret fiercely. Captured shells were destroyed to prevent enemy analysis. Sailors were instructed never to discuss the weapon. Even Allied commanders were sometimes kept in the dark, lest information leak. Only after the war would the full story emerge. The psychological effect was nearly as great as the physical one. Japanese pilots had been trained to brave anti-aircraft fire, knowing the odds of a shell striking them were slim. Now, the sky erupted with bursts triggered by proximity. Pilots felt hunted, trapped in an invisible cage of explosions. Morale eroded. Missions faltered. Commanders reported increasing reluctance among pilots to press attacks against ships known to use the new fuses. The first major test came on January 5, 1943, off the coast of Guadalcanal. The light cruiser, USS Helena, battle-hardened from months of combat, found herself under attack by Japanese Aichi-D. 3. Aval dive bombers. Gunners loaded the new shells. As the planes swooped closer, they opened fire. To the astonishment of every man on deck, explosions ripped through the sky, not on impact but in mid-air, shattering enemy aircraft with frightening precision. In minutes, 2 Vals disintegrated. The others, unnerved, broke off their attack. From that moment, the transformation was irreversible. Battle reports documented kill ratios unheard of in naval history. Where once hundreds of shells were required to bring down a single plane, now only a handful sufficed. The Navy's historian Samuel Eliot Morison later wrote, "The proximity fuse gave our guns teeth." For the first time, surface ships could defend themselves effectively against air attack. By mid-1943, proximity-fused ammunition was flowing into the Pacific in large numbers. Carriers like the USS Enterprise and USS Saratoga, prime targets of Japanese assaults, became floating fortresses. Destroyers, once considered vulnerable, gained newfound confidence, escorting convoys through contested waters. The turning point came during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, remembered by American aviators as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese carrier forces launched over 400 aircraft in desperate waves. American Hellcat fighters tore through them, but those that broke through met a wall of proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire. From the decks of battleships like the USS Washington, officers watched Zeros and torpedo planes erupt in mid-air as if swatted by an invisible hand. Lieutenant James Van Allen, the very scientist who had perfected shock-proof vacuum tubes, was there in person. Serving as a naval officer aboard Washington, he saw his invention in action. In a letter to his wife, he described the surreal sight. The sky was filled with black puffs, each one followed by a falling plane. I realized then that theoretical physics had become the difference between life and death. By battle's end, the Japanese had lost more than 300 planes in a single day. American naval losses amounted to a few dozen aircraft, mostly to accidents. Carrier aviation, the pride of the Imperial Navy, was crippled beyond repair. Yet the Japanese were not finished. If conventional attacks had become suicidal, desperation bred a new tactic: kamikaze strikes. In late 1944, planes loaded with fuel and explosives dove deliberately into American ships. Against such attackers, the proximity fuse still performed miracles, blasting many kamikazes into fragments before impact. But as sailors grimly noted, fragments traveling at 300 miles per hour could still smash into decks. Ships burned, lives were lost. Still, Without the fuse, the toll would have been catastrophic. At Okinawa, the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War, American fleets endured waves of kamikazes numbering in the hundreds. Destroyers like the USS Hadley fired thousands of proximity-fused shells in single engagements, downing dozens of attackers. Though some ships were lost, most survived precisely because. But another theater, far colder and closer to home, still waited for its debut: Europe. Then came the Battle of the Bulge. December 16, 1944. In the snowy forests of the Ardennes, German forces launched their last great offensive, striking with surprise against thin American lines. At first, success was theirs. U.S. troops fell back, villages burned, panic spread. But American artillery officers held a trump card still secret from most of their own men. In their bunkers sat crates of proximity-fused shells, delivered with orders for restricted use. Colonel Oscar Axelson, of the 406th Artillery Group, faced a desperate choice. His forward cavalry squadron was being overwhelmed. Standard shells would slow the Germans but not stop them. If he used the proximity fuses and they were captured, the Germans might copy them. But if he held back, his men would die. At dawn, he gave the order: load proximity fuses, set for airburst. The effect was apocalyptic. German infantry advancing across open snowfields were suddenly engulfed in explosions 30 feet above their heads. Shrapnel rained downward in cones of death, reaching into foxholes, trenches, and behind cover. Survivors fled into forests, only to be caught by shells bursting in the treetops, showering them with wood splinters and steel. Captured German accounts described the horror. One Feldwebel reported, "We had survived Russian artillery, Normandy bombardments, everything. But this was different. No hole was deep enough, no wall thick enough. It was as if the sky itself had turned against us." In just minutes, entire battalions were annihilated. American observers estimated casualty rates of 70 to 80%. Survivors stumbled back, repeating the same phrase in disbelief: "Die Luft, Tote, the air kills." Word spread quickly. General Eisenhower, initially cautious about deploying the weapon on land, authorized unrestricted use across the front. Within days, every American artillery unit in the Ardennes was firing proximity-fused shells. German advances stalled. Morale collapsed. Soldiers who had marched confidently into Belgium now surrendered en masse rather than face the invisible death overhead. General George S. Patton, never one for understatement, exulted. "The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. When all armies have it, we'll need a new kind of warfare. Thank God we had it first." Statistics confirm his view. During the Bulge, American artillery fired over 200,000 proximity-fused rounds. German casualty estimates ran into the tens of thousands. Entire attacks that might have broken Allied lines simply evaporated under airbursts. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last gamble, collapsed. The impact was more than physical. It was psychological, eroding the will of soldiers who no longer trusted even their foxholes. Artillery had always been feared, but it could be endured. With proximity fuses, endurance became impossible. Cover was a myth. By January 1943, Crosley workers were soldering components onto circuit boards 24 hours a day. Security was absolute. Workers were told they were making radio parts or special electrical devices. Very few suspected they were assembling the most advanced weapon of the war. Production ramped up at an astonishing pace. In December 1942, the U.S. produced just 500 fuses per day. By June 1943, output reached 8,000 daily. By early 1944, factories were churning out 70,000 proximity fuses every day, more than Germany's entire monthly output of conventional fuses. The women who worked these lines carried untold risks. Beryllium, used in the soldering process, was toxic. Many workers developed illnesses decades later. Families only discovered the truth long after loved ones had died. Yet in the 1940s, there was little awareness of long-term hazards. These women were praised as heroes of production, the silent army behind the front line. The statistics were staggering. 87 companies involved, 110 factories producing components, 80,000 workers at peak production, 22 million fuses manufactured by war's end. Merle Tuve, overseeing the effort from Johns Hopkins, insisted on one principle above all: do not save money. Save time. To him, every week shaved from production schedules meant Allied lives spared. His laboratory walls bore signs reminding workers, "It's failure, there is our failure." The proximity fuse became a triumph, not just of science, but of mobilization. America had proven that civilian industry, when unleashed, could achieve what no dictatorship could: the mass production of miracles. To protect the secret, the military adopted measures bordering on paranoia. The very name, proximity fuse, was classified. Official documents referred only to VT fuses, standing for variable time. This misleading label suggested nothing revolutionary, merely another type of timing mechanism. Security slips did occur. In Sicily, 1943, a dud proximity shell landed on a beach. A frantic recovery team raced to retrieve it before German forces could investigate. They succeeded, but the incident prompted tighter restrictions. For much of the war, proximity fuses were prohibited for land combat, specifically to avoid the risk of capture. Only in the Ardennes, under extreme necessity, was this rule broken. In December 1944, German troops did capture thousands of fuses when they overran an American supply dump. The nightmare seemed realized, but when German scientists examined them, they concluded the devices were fakes. One post-war interrogation revealed their reasoning. No vacuum tube could survive such forces. It was American propaganda. They had the miracle in their hands and dismissed it as impossible. Even within Allied ranks, secrecy bred myths. British gunners, using the fuses against V-1 flying bombs in 1944, were told the shells contained radio brains. Some soldiers joked. They were filled with gremlins, trained to sniff out planes. At the Applied Physics Laboratory, security officers addressed everyone as "Doctor," preventing outsiders from identifying true scientists. FBI background checks screened every worker. Letters home were censored. Employees often joked that they could describe their jobs only as classified soldering. Despite such precautions, espionage eventually breached the program. In 1944, Julius Rosenberg stole fuse designs while working at Emerson Radio and passed them to Soviet intelligence. By the Korean War, Communist forces were using proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells, clones of American designs, against U.S. aircraft. The theft remained hidden until Rosenberg's arrest in 1950. In Berlin's laboratories, under the watchful eye of the Reich's ministries, scientists worked feverishly to unlock miracles of their own. Germany had produced the V-2 rocket, the jet fighter, and deadly U-boats. Yet in one crucial field, proximity fuses their efforts collapsed into failure, scattered across institutions more eager to compete than cooperate. The Wehrmacht understood the concept. In fact, fragments of the idea had reached them as early as 1939, through the so-called Oslo Report, a bundle of intelligence documents smuggled from Britain. Within those pages lay descriptions of experimental fuses triggered by radio waves. German researchers dismissed them as impractical. No electronic circuit could survive the fury of an artillery gun, they insisted. By 1942, the Luftwaffe's anti-aircraft command faced a crisis. American and British bombers were reducing German cities to rubble. Conventional timed fuses and predictor-controlled flak were inefficient. Thousands of shells were fired for each aircraft destroyed. Engineers at Rheinmetall Borsig, the industrial giant of German armaments, began experimenting with alternatives. Some designs relied on acoustic sensors, microphones tuned to the roar of bomber engines. Others tested electrostatic fields, detonating when a shell neared the metallic body of an aircraft. Still others pursued photoelectric cells that reacted to changing light levels as a plane passed overhead. The Kriegsmarine, fighting a desperate defense against Allied naval dominance, tried its own path. Engineers at Kiel developed magnetic influence fuses, designed to react to the steel hulls of ships. But again, problems mounted. Magnetic fields varied with soil and environment, leading to premature detonations. By 1943, German naval officers had lost faith in the concept. The most striking obstacle remained miniaturized vacuum tubes. German electronics relied on larger, fragile tubes suited for radios and radar, but hopeless under the acceleration of a gun. The Americans, through James Van Allen's mousetrap spring innovation and industrial breakthroughs, had solved the problem. Germany had not. Dr. Werner Ramboksi, one of the Reich's leading fuse experts, later admitted under interrogation, "We understood the principle. We built prototypes, but they shattered upon firing. Without the ability to mass-produce tiny, shock-proof tubes, our efforts were doomed." Political fragmentation worsened the situation. The Luftwaffe guarded its projects. The Wehrmacht pursued others. The Kriegsmarine insisted on independence. And SS research facilities conducted secret parallel experiments. None shared information. Each jealously hoarded resources, even as bombs rained on German factories. This failure of imagination was fatal. By the time some researchers began to suspect the truth, Germany's industry was collapsing. Factories lay in ruins, raw materials dwindled, laboratories evacuated. Even if they had understood, they lacked the capacity to respond. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt summarized it in his post-war testimony. "The American proximity fuse made our defensive positions untenable. Centuries of doctrine, digging trenches, hiding in bunkers, became useless overnight. We had no answer, and by the time we realized this, the war was already lost." Germany, a nation that had pioneered rockets and jets, fell behind in the one technology that could have defended its cities. The failure was not only technical, it was organizational, political, and cultural. A dictatorship that stifled cooperation and distrusted outsiders could not replicate the miracle of Anglo-American science. If Germany's failure to develop proximity fuses was tragic, Japan's was catastrophic. On the vast ocean battlefields of the Pacific, the absence of such technology cost the Imperial Navy dearly. By 1943, Japanese pilots were already reporting the terrifying effectiveness of American anti-aircraft fire. Shells no longer needed direct hits. Planes were being shredded mid-air by invisible bursts, detonating with uncanny precision. Rumors spread of death rays, or secret American radars guiding each shell. Few guessed that the shells themselves contained miniature radars. Japanese scientists, like their German counterparts, attempted to investigate. The Naval Technical Research Institute in Tokyo experimented with photoelectric sensors, hoping to detonate bombs when shadows crossed light-sensitive cells. Tests were crude. One prototype was dropped from an aircraft in 1945. It failed. The Japanese response was not technical but tactical. If aircraft could not survive proximity-fused fire, then survival ceased to matter. Thus was born the Kamikaze strategy planes, transformed into guided missiles, pilots into human warheads. At Leyte Gulf in October 1944, and even more brutally at Okinawa in 1945, kamikazes demonstrated the logic of desperation. A plane destroyed 50 feet from its target by a proximity fuse had failed. A kamikaze destroyed 50 feet from its target might still crash into a ship. Through sheer momentum, American sailors recognized the grim truth. Gunner's mate, William Formby aboard USS Nashville, wrote in his diary, "Our shells would blow them apart, but the pieces kept coming. Wings, engines, even fragments of fuselage were still deadly at 300 miles per hour. The fuses saved us from most, but not all. God help the ships that took the ones we missed." Japanese pilots themselves sensed the imbalance. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, later confessed, "By 1944, American fire had become supernatural. Aircraft disintegrated in the air as if struck by invisible hands. We had no explanation. Some believed it was divine punishment." As the ashes of war cooled in Europe, another battle for the secrets of proximity fuses began, one fought not with artillery, but with spies, couriers, and stolen documents. The Soviet Union, an uneasy ally during World War II, had observed America's astonishing air defense performance with growing alarm. Stalin wanted the secret. By 1943, Soviet agents embedded in American industries began reporting on unusual activity at Crossley Corporation, Sylvania Electric, and other factories. These plants, supposedly producing radio components, operated under military guard. Workers were searched daily. Entire towns whispered about mysterious contracts that employed thousands of women, soldering tiny wires into glass and metal tubes. The Soviets recruited one of those workers, an engineer at Emerson Radio and Phonograph Corporation. His name would echo through history: Julius Rosenberg. Rosenberg, along with his brother-in-law David Greenglass, smuggled documents and even physical samples of proximity fuses to Soviet intelligence handlers. Greenglass worked at the Los Alamos laboratory, tied to the atomic project, but he also had access to subcontracted components from fuse production lines. In 1944, he passed Rosenberg a carefully disassembled fuse. The device traveled through clandestine channels to Moscow, where Soviet engineers examined it in awe. Colonel Leonid Kvasnikov, a senior NKVD officer overseeing technical espionage, filed a report to Stalin. "The Americans have developed a device using miniaturized radio tubes that detonate shells in proximity to aircraft. It is simple in concept, but brilliant in execution. This technology must be reproduced without delay." By 1946, Soviet laboratories were building copies. They lacked the production quality of American originals, but worked well enough to arm Soviet anti-aircraft batteries. When American pilots flew over Korea just 4 years later, they encountered radar-guided flak, equipped with proximity fuses, copied directly from Rosenberg's theft. Decades later, during his trial, prosecutors emphasized this theft. Rosenberg gave the Soviets not only the bomb, but the means to defend against our aircraft. He handed them the shield as well as the sword. Cold War analysts confirmed the point. By the early 1950s, the Soviet Union had achieved parity in proximity fuse technology ensuring that any American air offensive over Eastern Europe would be far more costly. The playing field had been leveled not by Soviet ingenuity, but by espionage. Still, the irony remained. While Germany and Japan had failed to reproduce the fuse even with captured examples, the Soviets succeeded because their agents stole not only devices, but also detailed production notes, specifications, and circuit diagrams. They did not need to rediscover Van Allen's shock-proof tubes or Tuve's circuit refinements. They received them ready-made, the result of betrayal. For Stalin, it was another confirmation that espionage could substitute for innovation. For America, it was a chilling lesson. No secret, however closely guarded, was beyond the reach of determined spies. Numbers alone cannot convey how deeply the proximity fuse reshaped military thinking. It forced commanders and tacticians to abandon doctrines that had stood for centuries, replacing them with strategies suited to a new reality: artillery that thought for itself. For half a millennium, artillery doctrine had been based on one principle: soldiers could protect themselves by digging in. Trenches, foxholes, and bunkers were the standard answer to enemy fire. Shells that struck the ground might wound those nearby, but most soldiers survived by lying low. The proximity fuse destroyed that logic overnight. By detonating shells 30 to 70 feet above the ground, the fuse turned the very earth into a killing zone. Fragments rained downward at steep angles, penetrating foxholes, slicing into dugouts, reaching behind walls. At Monschau, German veterans were stunned. We had survived Russian artillery, American artillery, British artillery, recalled Feldwebel Otto Hartmann. But this killed us in our holes. It was as if the air itself had turned against us. American commanders quickly grasped the tactical revolution. Infantry manuals were rewritten. Dispersion became mandatory. Overhead cover, once optional, became essential. Movement replaced static defense. As General James Gavin of the 82nd Airborne later wrote, the proximity fuse made traditional infantry tactics obsolete. To survive, men had to move, to scatter, to adapt. The foxhole was no longer safety. It was a coffin. Naval doctrine was equally transformed. Before proximity fuses, fleets relied heavily on combat air patrols, fighter aircraft that intercepted incoming bombers. Surface ships could defend themselves only weakly. After proximity fuses, every destroyer and cruiser became a fortress. A single ship, once vulnerable, could now repel waves of attackers with lethal efficiency. Admiral Raymond Spruance noted, "The proximity fuse gave us tactical freedom we never had before. We could disperse our forces, send ships on independent missions, confident they could defend themselves. It multiplied our effective fleet." Air defense doctrine evolved from statistical barrage to precision engagement. In 1942, anti-aircraft fire was essentially blind luck, with gunners filling the sky in hopes of scoring a hit. By 1944, proximity fuses allowed controlled, measured fire with high probability of kill. Gun crews transitioned from brute force shooters to precision marksmen. Training shifted accordingly. Fewer rounds, fired deliberately, now achieved more kills. The psychological effect on both friend and foe was immense. The proximity fuse marked the dawn of modern warfare. It blurred the line between dumb munitions and smart weapons. It foreshadowed an age when missiles would home in on heat, bombs would steer by lasers, and drones would fly themselves. The proximity fuse was not just a tool of World War II. It was a doctrinal earthquake, reshaping how armies conceived of firepower, protection, and survival. The proximity fuse did not die with World War II. It evolved, multiplied, and spread, shaping both military doctrine and civilian technology for decades. Its legacy can be traced in three distinct paths: Cold War military adoption, technological spin-offs, and the human cost of production. Militarily, the fuse became the template for smart weapons. The concept of a munition that could sense and respond to its environment foreshadowed radar-guided missiles, heat-seeking air-to-air weapons, and GPS-guided bombs. In the Korean War, American forces faced their own invention turned against them. Through espionage, the Soviet Union had acquired complete examples of the fuse. Julius Rosenberg, later executed for atomic espionage, had also passed proximity fuse secrets to Moscow. By 1950, Soviet anti-aircraft guns were firing shells equipped with fuses copied from American designs. The irony was bitter. The weapon that had saved American ships in the Pacific now threatened American pilots over Korea. But it also proved how revolutionary the concept was. No modern military could ignore the advantage of intelligent munitions. From that point on, every major power invested in fuse technology. Industrial practices, too, changed forever. The demand for 80% reliability under battlefield conditions drove American firms to invent new quality control methods. Western Electric's statistical process control, born out of fuse production, became the foundation of modern manufacturing standards. Today's aerospace and electronics industries trace their obsession with precision back to those wartime assembly lines. But the legacy was not purely technological. It carried a human cost. Factories employed tens of thousands of women, soldering delicate components with beryllium alloys, unaware of the long-term toxicity. Decades later, many fell ill with beryllium disease, a cruel lung condition. For them, the secret war work had consequences far beyond the battlefield. In congressional hearings of the 1980s and 1990s, children testified about mothers who had died from cancers linked to proximity fuse assembly. Their sacrifice was as real as that of soldiers, though recognized only belatedly. In the pantheon of 20th century innovations, few inventions stand as both a weapon of war and a foundation for peace as profoundly as the proximity fuse. Conceived in desperation, developed under secrecy, and deployed with staggering effectiveness, it left behind not just a trail of destroyed aircraft and shattered Nazi illusions, but also a set of enduring lessons about science, cooperation, and the responsibilities of power. The fuse's immediate wartime impact was undeniable. In 1944, the Allies turned the tide in Europe and the Pacific, not only through manpower and logistics, but through technological superiority. The proximity fuse was central to that advantage. American gunners no longer fired blindly into the skies, hoping for chance hits. They unleashed storms of shells that detonated with uncanny accuracy. German pilots, once confident in dive-bombing runs, now spoke in terror of the invisible wall of fire. The Luftwaffe had built its reputation on precision and daring, but proximity-fused shells stripped it of both. The Battle of the Bulge provided the most dramatic illustration. Snow cloaked the Ardennes as German forces surged through American lines in December 1944. The Wehrmacht, fighting with its last reserves, counted on the winter weather to ground Allied aircraft and shield its movements. But when German infantry pressed forward, they encountered a new horror. American artillery shells exploded above them, raining steel fragments over foxholes and trenches. The carefully rehearsed tactics of infiltration and cover dissolved in carnage. Veterans described the psychological devastation. It was as though the very air had turned against us. entire units were annihilated in moments. Their commanders, bewildered by a weapon no manual had prepared them to face. The campaign in the Pacific showed another face of the fuse's power. Against kamikaze attacks, the desperate suicide missions that threatened to turn the seas into Allied graveyards, the proximity fuse proved decisive. Navy crews armed with conventional shells had minutes, sometimes seconds, to target incoming aircraft. Most often they failed. But with the new fuses, every barrage became a wall of lethal airbursts. In the Battle of Okinawa, proximity-fused shells accounted for more than half the kamikazes destroyed before they reached American ships. Sailors credited the fuse with saving their lives. Admirals credited it with preserving the fleet. Historians later judged it the single most effective naval defense technology of the war. The fuse also guarded cities far from battlefronts. In 1944, German Von flying bombs, nicknamed doodlebugs, roared toward London and Antwerp. Anti-aircraft crews armed with proximity fuses achieved success rates unimaginable just months earlier. Where once dozens of shells had been needed to down a single flying bomb, now a few well-placed rounds sufficed. Civilians who had crouched in shelters, bracing for the scream of incoming terror, now dared to hope. Churchill himself declared the fuse among the most important inventions of the war, second only to radar and the atomic bomb. Economically and industrially, the project redefined manufacturing. To build millions of tiny, reliable fuses under wartime pressure, American companies had to revolutionize quality control. Western Electric, Sylvania Electric, and others devised statistical monitoring methods still standard today. Assembly line workers, many of them women, were trained to unprecedented levels of precision. This culture of reliability spilled over into post-war consumer electronics, aviation, and computing industries. But the legacy was not untainted. The use of beryllium alloys in manufacturing exposed thousands of workers to deadly dust. Many developed chronic beryllium disease or cancers. For decades, their suffering remained classified, hidden behind the veil of wartime secrecy. When the truth emerged in congressional hearings decades later, it painted a sobering picture. Even as the fuse saved lives in war, it cost lives at home. The technological triumph had a human shadow. And yet, for all its violence, the fuse seeded cooperation. Former enemies returned to peacetime roles transformed by what they had seen. German prisoners of war, who experienced American abundance, including meals protected by proximity-fused defenses, carried back to Europe a respect for democratic productivity. British scientists, who had risked everything on the Tizard, Gamble found vindication in post-war transatlantic cooperation. American engineers who had built the fuse went on to pioneer consumer electronics, computing, and space exploration. Thus, the proximity fuse's legacy is twofold: as a weapon of destruction that changed the outcome of World War II, and as a tool of transformation that propelled science, industry, and alliances into the modern age. It proved that technological superiority could be decisive, but it also revealed the responsibilities that come with such power. To wield knowledge is to shoulder its costs. To share knowledge is to shape the future. Open the heavens. The story of the proximity fuse is more than a tale of circuits and shells. It is a reminder that history turns on moments of trust, invention, and sacrifice. An invention the size of a fist redefined the skies, saved cities, and shattered illusions. It showed that a nation's true strength lies not only in its armies, but in its capacity to create, to innovate, and even to cooperate with others in its darkest hour. When the smoke of war cleared, the proximity fuse left behind No monuments, no parades, no grand speeches. Yet its impact still echoes in every guided weapon, in every radar-hardened circuit, in every alliance built on shared science. It is the legacy of an idea that transformed war, but also pointed toward peace. What other forgotten technologies do you think deserve to be remembered? Drop your thoughts in the comments, we read them all, and your ideas often guide our next stories.